I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of my patrol car, sir.
Yes, sir.
For what reason, officer?
For my safety.
You're becoming argumentative.
The midday sun beat down on the clean, wide streets of Prescott, Arizona, baking the asphalt and making the air shimmer above the parked cars. It was a day of stark contrasts, the deep, cloudless blue of the sky against the rich red of the surrounding buttes. For Officer Kevin Dean, it was a day of order. At 26, Dean was a product of the modern policing academy. Ramrod straight posture, a haircut so sharp it could have been done with a laser, and a belief in the absolute, unambiguous clarity of the law. His uniform was immaculate, the creases in his trousers precise enough to slice paper. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the distorted image of a world he was tasked with keeping in line. He saw his beat not as a community of people, but as a grid of statutes, a checklist of potential infractions. His job was to find the check marks that were out of place. He found one in the form of a 1988 Ford F-150. It was parked in a 30-minute commercial loading zone, a space clearly marked with a green curb and a sign that spelled out the rules in bold, uncompromising letters. The truck was a relic from another era. Its original royal blue paint was faded to the color of a pale sky, with patches of primer gray covering old wounds. A filigree of rust crept along the edges of the wheel wells. It was clean, well-maintained for its age, but it was undeniably old and tired. To Dean, it was an eyesore, a piece of disorder in the otherwise tidy picture of the downtown square. He glanced at his watch. He'd passed this spot 40 minutes ago. The truck hadn't moved. A clear violation. With the efficient, detached movements of a surgeon, he unclipped the electronic ticketing device from his belt. The screen glowed to life, asking for the make, model, and license plate. He began inputting the information, his thumbs moving with practiced speed. He felt a familiar, quiet satisfaction. This was policing at its purest. There was no emotion, no gray area. There was a rule, and the rule had been broken. His function was to document it, to apply the prescribed penalty. It was simple. It was clean. He was restoring a tiny piece of the world to its correct state. The device whirred softly as it printed the ticket, a crisp white rectangle of accountability. He pulled it from the slot and was about to place it under the driver's side windshield wiper when a voice, calm and measured, spoke from behind him. "Excuse me, officer." Dean turned. Standing on the sidewalk was a man who seemed to belong to the truck. He was tall, but his shoulders were slightly stooped by the gravity of age. He couldn't have been younger than 80. With a full head of thick white hair and a face etched with the kind of deep lines that speak of long years spent under an unforgiving sun. He wore simple khaki pants and a plaid button-down shirt. As he stepped off the curb, Dean noticed a pronounced limp in his right leg, a slight catch in his gait that suggested an old, settled injury. The man had just come out of the post office, a single stamped envelope in his hand. "This your vehicle, sir?" Dean asked, his tone flat. "Professional?" He held the ticket in his hand, not aggressively, but as a statement of fact. "It is," the old man said, his eyes, a surprisingly clear and piercing blue, met Dean's. "I do apologize. I was just mailing a letter to my grandson. He's stationed at Fort Bragg. The line was a bit longer than I expected." Dean gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He'd heard it all before. The excuses, the stories, the justifications. Everyone had a reason. A sick child, a forgotten wallet, a longer-than-expected line. To him, they were all just noise that obscured the simple, elegant truth of the violation. "I understand, sir," he said. the words a pre-recorded script he'd used 100 times. However, this is a commercial loading zone. It's for active loading and unloading only, with a 30-minute limit. Your vehicle has been here for over 40 minutes. The law is the law. The old man looked from Dean's impassive face to the ticket in his hand. He didn't look angry or flustered. Instead, a flicker of something like disappointment crossed his features, a subtle sadness that seemed out of proportion to the situation. He sighed, a quiet exhalation of breath. "Yes, I suppose it is," he said softly. "May I see your identification, please, and the registration for the vehicle?" Dean extended his hand. Palm up. The request was standard procedure, but in the context of a simple parking violation, it was also a subtle assertion of dominance. He wasn't just giving a ticket. He was conducting an official stop. He was in control. The old man nodded slowly. "Of course. My wallet is in the truck. I'll just get it for you." He turned and took a step toward the driver's side door. "Hold on, sir." Dean's voice was sharper now. "Stay right where you are. I'll retrieve it for you. Just tell me where it is." This was a precaution, a rule hammered into him at the academy. Never let a subject return to their vehicle. It was an unnecessary escalation, a measure designed for felony stops, not for dealing with an octogenarian mailing a letter. But for Dean, procedure was procedure. There were no degrees of risk, only the binary state of safe or unsafe. Beneath his calm exterior, a cold knot of frustration was beginning to form in Dean's stomach. This should have taken 30 seconds. He should have placed the ticket on the windshield and been on his way. But the old man's presence, his quiet refusal to be dismissed, had complicated it. He was a variable Dean hadn't accounted for, a human element in a mathematical equation. And as the old man stood there, waiting patiently under the bright Arizona sun, Dean couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being judged, and that the simple, clean lines of the law were about to get very blurry indeed. He had no idea that the man he was treating like a common nuisance had stood on battlefields where the only law was survival. He had no idea that the wallet he was about to demand contained proof of a life lived on a scale he couldn't possibly comprehend. And he had no idea that, in the next 5 minutes, his entire conception of duty, honor, and the law was about to be irrevocably shattered. The old man, whose name was Samuel Abernathy, though Officer Dean hadn't bothered to ask, stopped and turned back. He showed no sign of agitation at the sharp command. His expression remained one of mild weariness, as if this were just another small, unnecessary complication in a world full of them. He looked at the young officer, at the taut line of his jaw and the sunglasses that hid his eyes, and he saw not a man, but an instrument. A young man wound tight, coiled around a core of rules and regulations. "There's no need for that, son," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm. "My wallet is in the glove compartment. The registration is in there with it. I'm happy to get it for you. Or you can get it, whichever you prefer." The word son landed on Dean like a spark. It was patronizing. It was a subtle shift in the power dynamic that he couldn't allow. He was the authority figure here. He was officer, not son. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back onto the sidewalk," Dean said, his voice losing its robotic neutrality and gaining a hard edge. "I will retrieve the documents. You were parked illegally, and now you are complicating the stop." "Complicating it?" Samuel's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm trying to comply with your request." "I told you where the documents are. What's the complication?" This was the part Dean hated. The questions, the pushback. He was used to the grudging, fearful compliance of people who knew they were in the wrong. He wasn't used to this quiet, unyielding logic. It felt like insubordination. He saw Samuel Abernathy not as an elderly citizen, but as a challenge. The beat-up truck, the expired time limit, and now the driver's calm defiance. It was all part of the same pattern of disorder he was sworn to correct. "The complication, sir," Dean retorted, putting a deliberate, mocking emphasis on the word, "is that I give the instructions here. Now please, step up onto the curb." Samuel looked at Dean for a long moment. He saw the tension in the officer's shoulders, the way his hand was resting near the butt of his sidearm, a gesture that was either unconscious habit or a deliberate act of intimidation. He had seen that same look in the eyes of young lieutenants, fresh out of officer training, who mistook authority for wisdom and aggression for strength. They were often the most dangerous men in a firefight, brittle and unpredictable. Samuel decided that arguing further would be pointless, like reasoning with a storm. He gave a slow, deliberate nod and stepped back onto the sidewalk, his limp more pronounced as he navigated the curb. He stood with his hands held loosely at his sides, in plain sight. Dean approached the driver's side of the old Ford. He touched the tailgate as he passed, a standard tactic to leave fingerprints. He peered through the driver's side window before trying the handle. It was unlocked. The interior of the truck smelled faintly of old leather, motor oil, and coffee. It was Spartan, but immaculately clean. The bench seat was covered with a simple woven blanket. There were no fast food wrappers, no discarded lottery tickets, no clutter. Just a well-worn Bible on the passenger seat and a pair of leather work gloves on the dash. It didn't look like the truck of a man who was careless with rules. He opened the glove compartment. Inside, nestled next to a tire pressure gauge and a small first aid kit, was a worn leather wallet. It was the old-fashioned kind, a thick bifold held together by the sheer force of its contents. He pulled it out. Next to it was the vehicle registration, tucked neatly into a plastic sleeve. He took that as well. He closed the glove compartment and backed out of the truck, holding the items. He felt a surge of control. He had the man's identity, his proof of ownership. He was back in command of the situation. He walked back to where Samuel was waiting, the wallet in one hand, the registration in the other. He opened the wallet. He glanced at the driver's license. Samuel J. Abernathy, age 84. Address, a small ranch on the outskirts of town. He looked from the photo, a picture of the same man, his expression just as serious, though with a few less lines around his eyes, back to the man himself. "Is this your current address, Mr. Abernathy?" Dean asked, falling back into the familiar rhythm of the script. "It is," Samuel replied. "Lived there for 50 years. "It's a nice truck," Dean said, the question a non sequitur. It was a fishing expedition, a technique to gauge the man's reaction, to look for any inconsistency. "What did you do for a living? To afford a place out there?" The question was entirely inappropriate and irrelevant to the traffic stop. It was a question born of suspicion, a vague, unformed idea that this man, in this old truck, didn't quite fit the picture. He saw an old man who wasn't showing the proper amount of fear, and he decided he needed to dig. Samuel Abernathy's calm demeanor finally cracked, but not in the way Dean expected. His expression didn't turn to anger or fear. It hardened into something else, a profound and formidable stillness. His piercing blue eyes seemed to look straight through the young officer. "Officer," Samuel said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its gentle, grandfatherly tone and taking on the quality of cold, hard steel. "My employment history has no bearing on this situation. You have my license. You have my registration. You have yet to give me the ticket you wrote for my alleged parking violation. May we please conclude this business?" The rebuke was sharp, precise, and utterly unexpected. Dean felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. He was used to being in charge, to people fumbling and stammering in his presence. This old man, with his limping gait and his ancient truck, was talking to him like a peer, like an equal. In Officer Kevin Dean's world, there were no equals on a traffic stop. There was only the enforcer and the enforced. He had stepped onto this street to correct a minor infraction, a simple matter of a parking ticket. But now, it had become something more. It had become a battle of wills, and in the bright, unforgiving light of day, it was a battle he was determined to win. The tension on the street corner had become a palpable thing. It was no longer just a cop and a citizen. It was a standoff. The quiet hum of downtown life, the distant chatter from an outdoor cafe, the gentle swish of a passing car seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the charged silence between the two men. Officer Dean felt the eyes of passers-by on him. A couple walking a dog slowed their pace. Their curiosity piqued. A delivery driver unloading a van paused, watching the scene unfold. Dean felt a prickle of irritation. This should have been private, efficient. A public audience only complicated things. Samuel Abernathy remained on the sidewalk, a statue of quiet defiance. He had answered the officer's legitimate questions and had rightfully refused the illegitimate ones. He had done nothing wrong except overstay his welcome in a parking spot by a few minutes while mailing a letter. Now, he was being treated like a suspect in a crime. He understood what was happening. This was no longer about a parking violation. It was about pride. It was about a young man with a badge who felt his authority had been questioned and was now using the power of his office to reassert it. An attitude problem, Dean muttered, just loud enough for Samuel to hear. That's what we've got here. He looked down at the license and registration in his hand, as if searching for another infraction, another lever he could pull. He was so focused on his quarry that he didn't notice the young woman who had stopped about 30 feet away. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, a journalism student at the local community college. She had been on her way to the library when she saw the encounter. At first, she thought little of it. But then she saw the officer's posture, rigid, aggressive, and the old man's calm, statuesque stillness. She saw the officer invade the man's truck, and she saw the way he confronted him afterward. Her instincts, honed by her studies and her generation's deep-seated distrust of unchecked authority, screamed that something was wrong. She took out her smartphone. She didn't hold it up ostentatiously. She just let it rest in her hand, angling it slightly, and pressed record. The small red light on the screen was a silent, unblinking eye. "I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of my patrol car." "Sir," Dean said. The command was absurd. It was a massive escalation, a procedure for a potentially dangerous suspect, not an 84-year-old man holding a letter. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "For what reason, officer?" he asked, his voice still steady, but now laced with a note of incredulity. "For my safety," Dean snapped back, the justification thin and reflexive. "You're becoming argumentative. I need to ensure this situation doesn't escalate." "You are the one escalating it," Samuel stated plainly. It was an observation, not an accusation, but it struck Dean like a physical blow. "That's it. Hands on the car. Now," Dean commanded, taking a step toward him. "Or I'll add resisting an officer to the citation." It was at that moment that Sarah Jenkins decided to move. She didn't intervene directly. She just walked a few paces closer, making her presence and the presence of her phone more obvious. The screen was now clearly visible, pointed directly at them. Dean saw her out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, his focus momentarily shifting from Samuel to the woman. "Ma'am, you need to step back," he said, his voice tight with annoyance. "This is official police business." "I'm on a public sidewalk," Sarah replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm well within my rights to be here and to record." Her calm recitation of her rights seemed to infuriate Dean even more. He was now being challenged on two fronts. The world was refusing to conform to his simple, orderly expectations. He felt trapped. If he backed down now, in front of the old man and this woman with her camera, he would look weak. His ego, already bruised, couldn't take it. He made a decision, a disastrous one, fueled by pride and a profound lack of judgment. He turned his back on Sarah, dismissing her as a nuisance, and focused his full attention back on Samuel. "Last time, old man, hands on the car." He gestured with his head toward his cruiser, which was parked just behind Samuel's truck. Samuel looked past Dean and saw the young woman with the phone. He gave her the slightest of nods, a silent acknowledgement. A witness. Good. He then looked back at Officer Dean. He had faced down men with machine guns and mortars. He would not be intimidated by a boy with a badge and a wounded ego. But he was also a pragmatist. He knew that physical resistance would only lead to a broken bone and a slew of fabricated charges. He would comply with the physical order, but he would not surrender his dignity. "I am complying under duress," Samuel said, his voice clear and resonant, projecting for the benefit of Sarah's microphone. "I do not believe there is a lawful reason for this order, and I am not a threat to you in any way." He turned slowly and walked the few steps to the patrol car. The limp in his leg seemed more pronounced on the uneven pavement. He placed his hands, palms down, on the warm hood of the vehicle. The metal was hot from the sun. He felt the vibration of the engine running. He stared at his own reflection in the dark blue paint, a distorted image of an old man in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. He felt the officer's presence behind him, felt the heat of his anger. The sound of the smartphone's recording was the only thing that gave him a sliver of hope. It was a silent testament, a promise that this moment of humiliation, this gross abuse of power on a sunny street in Prescott, would not go unseen. It would not be forgotten. With Samuel Abernathy's hands on the hood of the cruiser, a line had been crossed. The encounter was no longer a misunderstanding or a case of an officer being overly officious. It had morphed into an unlawful detainment. There was no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, nothing to justify this level of action. There was only Officer Dean's escalating frustration and his desperate need to regain control of a situation he had single-handedly created. He knew, on some level, that he was deep in procedural violation. The academy instructors had drilled it into them. Every action must be justified, articulable. What was his justification here? An old man's calm tone? His refusal to answer an illegal question? Dean pushed the thoughts aside. He had committed to this path, and the only way out was forward. "Spread your feet," he ordered, his voice a low growl. He nudged Samuel's right ankle with the toe of his polished boot. "That's enough." "Officer," Samuel said, his voice sharp, losing its placid quality for the first time. "I am unarmed. I am compliant. You have no cause to search me. I'll be the judge of that." Dean grunted. He began a pat-down, a Terry frisk, but it was a sham. The law required him to have a reasonable belief that the subject was armed and dangerous. There was absolutely nothing about the 84-year-old man in the plaid shirt to suggest he was armed. This wasn't about safety. It was about degradation. It was a physical assertion of power. His hands moved roughly over Samuel's back and down his legs. He felt nothing but the man's wallet in his back pocket and the solid, unyielding stillness of his frame. The search produced nothing, which only seemed to fuel Dean's anger. His plan to uncover some hidden justification, some secret that would prove him right, had failed. He was left with nothing but his own bad judgment, now being recorded for the world to see. He stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't just end it here. He couldn't just say, "Okay, you can go." That would be an admission of defeat. He needed a win. He needed to be right. His eyes fell on the old Ford F-150. The truck. That's where the answer had to be. In his mind, the vehicle had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with this picture. It was old. It was out of place. It was defiant, just like its owner. He convinced himself there had to be something inside, an open container, drugs, an illegal weapon. He constructed a fantasy that would vindicate his actions. "I'm going to secure your vehicle," Dean announced, his tone falsely official. It was a pretext. What he meant was, "I'm going to search your vehicle." "You do not have my consent to do that," Samuel said clearly, not turning his head. "You do not have a warrant, and you do not have probable cause." Samuel was reciting the Fourth Amendment. But to Dean, it sounded like a lawyer's trick. He had heard that a new legal marijuana dispensary had opened on the edge of town. It was a flimsy, desperate reach, but it was all he had. "I smell marijuana," Dean lied. The words came out of his mouth before he could even think them through. It was the nuclear option for a patrol officer, a phrase that, in many jurisdictions, was a skeleton key to unlock a vehicle search. It was a lie that could ruin a person's life, and he had just deployed it over a parking ticket. Sarah Jenkins, still filming, let out an audible gasp. She knew what that phrase meant. She knew it was a common, often abused pretext. Dean ignored her. He walked purposefully toward the F-150, his stride now imbued with a false sense of righteousness. He had his justification, however flimsy and dishonest. He was going to tear this truck apart until he found something, anything, to prove that he had been right all along. He reached the driver's side door, the one he had stood by just minutes earlier. This time, he wasn't just peering inside, he was going in. Samuel watched him, his hands still flat on the hood of the cruiser. A deep, profound sadness washed over him. He had fought in foreign lands for the ideals of the country this young man represented. He had seen friends die for the Constitution that this officer was now shredding on a sun-drenched street corner. The lie about marijuana was a deeper wound than the illegal search or the public humiliation. It was an attack on the truth itself, a perversion of the law he was sworn to uphold. Dean pulled the handle. The old door creaked open with a groan of tired metal. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the Spartan interior, looking for the evidence that he had just invented. He tossed the pair of work gloves from the dashboard onto the floor. He ran his hand under the bench seat, feeling for anything taped or hidden. Nothing. He was about to turn his attention to the Bible on the passenger seat when a glint of light caught his eye. It was something hanging from the driver's side sun visor, something small that twisted in the slight breeze created by the open door. He hadn't noticed it before. It was just a little piece of metal and ribbon, tucked away almost shyly. He reached up and pulled the sun visor down to get a better look. And that's when Officer Kevin Dean's world tilted on its axis. The sunlight, pouring through the windshield, struck the object, and for a heart-stopping second, it seemed to blaze with an inner fire. It wasn't just a trinket or an air freshener. It was a 5-pointed star, hanging from a pale blue ribbon adorned with 13 white stars. In the center of the star was the profile of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and righteous war. It was an object few have ever seen in person, a symbol of courage so extreme it defies comprehension. It was the Medal of Honor. Time seemed to slow down. The ambient sounds of the street, the distant traffic, the rustle of leaves in the sycamore trees lining the square, all faded into a dull, rushing roar in Officer Dean's ears. He stared at the medal, his mind, which seconds before had been buzzing with a frantic, self-justifying energy, went utterly and completely blank. He was looking at an object that he had only ever seen in history books and on the hallowed walls of military museums. It was a symbol that carried the weight of a nation's deepest gratitude, an emblem of sacrifice that transcended politics, rank, and time itself. His brain struggled to process the cognitive dissonance. The man he had profiled as a non-compliant, argumentative troublemaker, the owner of the junker truck he had illegally detained and was now illegally searching based on a lie, that man was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. The two realities were so diametrically opposed that they couldn't coexist in his mind. One of them had to be false. And as he looked at the unmistakable design of the medal, at the way the light caught the inscription on the back, he knew with a sickening certainty that the lie was his own. Everything he had constructed in his head about this situation, about this man, was a fiction. The medal hung there, gently swaying. It was attached to the sun visor not with a fancy case or a proud display, but with a simple, common paperclip, as if its owner regarded it with a practicality that bordered on reverence. It was a part of his daily life, a quiet companion on his drives into town, not a trophy to be brandished. This small detail, more than anything, underscored the chasm between the medal's meaning and the owner's humility. Dean's hand, which had been reaching for the Bible, froze in midair. He felt a tremor start in his fingers, a cold, electric shock that traveled up his arm and into his chest. He felt like a vandal who had broken into a church and was caught standing before the altar. He had not just violated a man's rights, he had desecrated something sacred. The air in the truck cab suddenly felt thick and suffocating. He pulled his head out of the vehicle, gulping for fresh air, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He looked over at Samuel Abernathy, who was still standing exactly where Dean had ordered him, his hands resting calmly on the patrol car. But Dean no longer saw an old man. He saw the figure who belonged to the medal. He saw a man who had, at some point in his life, faced unimaginable terror and acted with a bravery so profound that his country had bestowed upon him its highest possible honor, and he, Officer Kevin Dean, had just lied to his face and kicked his ankle. The ticket he had written, the flimsy piece of paper that had started this entire chain of events, was still clutched in his other hand. It felt ridiculous now, an absurd and pathetic artifact from a world that no longer existed. A $40 fine for illegal parking. He looked from the ticket to the medal, and the sheer cosmic insignificance of his actions crashed down upon him. He had been so obsessed with enforcing the letter of the law that he had trampled all over its spirit. He had been so focused on a minor transgression that he had committed a major one. From across the street, Sarah Jenkins zoomed in with her phone's camera. She couldn't see the medal itself, but she saw the officer's reaction. She saw him freeze, saw the color drain from his face, saw the way he stumbled back from the truck as if he had seen a ghost. She knew, in that instant, that he had found something. But it wasn't the marijuana he had claimed to smell. It was something that had completely and utterly broken him. The small crowd of onlookers had grown. They too saw the change in the officer's demeanor. The aggressive, confident cop was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling young man who looked lost and terrified. The power dynamic on the street corner had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Officer Dean was no longer the one in control. He was the one who was exposed, judged, and found wanting, not by a court of law, but by a small piece of metal and ribbon hanging from a sun visor. He looked at his own badge, the shiny silver shield on his chest, and for the first time in his career, he felt a burning, gut-wrenching shame. The silence that followed Dean's discovery was profound. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the full, crushing weight of his mistake. His entire professional identity, built on a foundation of rigid certainty and procedural correctness, crumbled into dust. He felt his legs weaken, and for a moment, he thought he might actually fall. He took a staggering step back from the F-150, his gaze locked on Samuel Abernathy. The man hadn't moved. He hadn't turned around. He simply stood there, waiting. His patience, which Dean had earlier mistaken for defiance, now seemed like an act of profound mercy. He was giving the young officer a moment to absorb the magnitude of his own folly. "Oh, God," Dean whispered, the words barely audible. The sound of his own voice was alien to him. It was the voice of a scared boy, not a law enforcement officer. He looked down at the ticket still in his hand. His fingers, now slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with the paper. With a convulsive, jerky motion, he tore it in half. Then he tore the halves into quarters, and the quarters into a flurry of tiny white scraps. The pieces fluttered from his grasp and scattered on the hot asphalt, a pathetic confetti of his shattered authority. It was a meaningless gesture, an attempt to undo what was already done, but it was the only thing his panicked mind could think of to do. He started walking toward Samuel, his steps uncertain. He felt the eyes of the small crowd on him, felt their judgment. He heard the distinct click of Sarah Jenkins's phone as she took a still picture. He was no longer an enforcer of the law. He was a public spectacle, the villain in a story that was being broadcast live as he approached. Samuel finally turned his head, his gaze meeting Dean's. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only that same deep, weary sadness Dean had seen earlier, now magnified. It was the look of a man who had seen too many young men make terrible, irreversible mistakes. "Sir," Dean began, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, I saw—" He couldn't bring himself to say the words. He couldn't name the symbol he had desecrated. He stopped a few feet from Samuel, without thinking, his training a distant memory. His body moved on instinct, an instinct he didn't know he had. His back straightened. His heels clicked together on the pavement. He brought his right hand up in a crisp, formal salute. It was a gesture of profound deference, a complete surrender. He was no longer Officer Dean addressing a civilian. He was a junior officer acknowledging a four-star general. "Mr. Zay Abernathy," Dean said, his voice thick with emotion. "My apologies. I was wrong. This was my fault. All of it." The apology hung in the air. It was insufficient. It was a thimble of water offered to a man dying of thirst in the desert, but it was all he had. Samuel held his gaze for a moment longer before slowly lowering his hands from the hood of the patrol car. He turned to face Dean fully. He didn't return the salute. He was a civilian now, and that gesture belonged to a different life. He simply nodded. "The harm is done, officer," Samuel said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that seemed to press down on Dean. "Not to me. I'm an old man. I've endured worse than a difficult afternoon. The harm is done to the trust people are supposed to have in that uniform you're wearing." He gestured with his chin toward Dean's badge. "You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the oath you took." Each word was a nail in the coffin of Dean's career. He knew it was over. The video was out there. The lie about the marijuana was on record. The unlawful detainment was witnessed. He had not just bent the rules, he had shattered them in broad daylight. Just then, a second patrol car pulled up, its arrival unnoticed amidst the drama. The door opened and a portly sergeant with a graying mustache and weary eyes stepped out. It was Sergeant Marcus Riley, Dean's watch commander. He had been monitoring the radio and had heard the prolonged silence after Dean called in the initial stop. A 10-second parking ticket interaction had stretched to nearly 15 minutes. That was a red flag. "Dean, what the hell is going on here?" Riley boomed, his voice accustomed to cutting through chaos. He strode onto the scene, his eyes taking everything in. Dean standing stiffly at attention, a crowd of people watching, a young woman with a phone, and Samuel Abernathy standing calmly beside the first cruiser. Riley's eyes narrowed. He knew Samuel. Not well. But everyone in town knew of him. He was a local legend, a quiet hero from the Korean War. Then Riley's gaze fell on the torn pieces of the ticket scattered on the ground. He looked at the pale, stricken face of his rookie officer. He looked back at Samuel Abernathy. And in that moment, Sergeant Riley, a man with 25 years on the force, understood everything. A sick feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. "Oh, Kevin," Riley said, his voice a low, horrified groan. "What did you do?" Sergeant Riley's question wasn't really a question. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of the disaster unfolding before him. He was looking at the wreckage of a young officer's career, and he knew his first job was to contain the blast radius. His weary eyes swept over the scene again, cataloging the damage. The F-150's door was still hanging open. The crowd was growing, their phones like a constellation of small, accusatory stars. And at the center of it all was his rookie, Officer Dean, looking like a statue that was about to crumble. "Mr. Abernathy," Riley said, his tone immediately shifting to one of deep, genuine respect. He completely ignored Dean for the moment, walking directly to the elderly man. "Are you all right, sir?" "I'm fine. Marcus." Samuel replied, using the sergeant's first name. Their paths had crossed over the years at Memorial Day parades and town hall meetings. Just a bit of a misunderstanding. Riley knew it was far more than that. Samuel Abernathy was not a man given to hyperbole. His deliberate understatement was more damning than any angry tirade could have been. "I see," Riley said, his jaw tight. He turned to face Dean. The full force of his command presence, honed over 2.5 decades of dealing with everything from domestic disputes to armed standoffs, was now focused on the young officer. "Dean, what happened? Give me the short version. And it better be the truth." Dean flinched as if he'd been struck. He lowered his salute, his arm dropping heavily to his side. "Sir, I observed a parking violation," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The situation, it escalated." "It escalated?" Riley's voice was dangerously low. "Or you escalated it?" He glanced over at Sarah Jenkins, who was still recording. "I have a feeling that young lady over there has a more objective version of the story." He then looked back at the open door of the F-150. "And why is Mr. Abernathy's vehicle open? Did you have his consent to search it?" Dean's face, already pale, went completely white. He couldn't speak. The lie about smelling marijuana was lodged in his throat, a toxic lump of shame. He just shook his head mutely. Riley closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of profound disappointment and anger. "Okay," he said, reopening them. "Here's what's going to happen. Kevin, you're going to hand me your notepad and the ticket printer. You are going to get in the passenger seat of my car, and you are not going to say another word until I tell you to. Am I understood?" "Sir, Am I understood? Riley repeated, his voice like cracking ice. Yes, sir, Dean mumbled. He looked utterly defeated. He unclipped the devices from his belt and handed them to his sergeant like a surrendering soldier handing over his rifle. He walked, head down, to the passenger side of Riley's cruiser, the short distance feeling like a mile-long walk of shame. Riley watched him go before turning back to Samuel. Sir, on behalf of the Prescott Police Department, I want to offer you our most sincere and profound apology. What happened here today was inexcusable. It was not a reflection of our standards or our training. It was a reflection of his standards, Marcus. Samuel corrected him gently. He's your officer. The uniform makes you all one and the same in the public's eye. The truth of that statement hit Riley hard. He knew Samuel was right. This wasn't just Dean's failure. It was the department's failure. They had hired him, trained him, and put him on the street with a badge and a gun. They owned this. You're right, sir, Riley said, his voice heavy. And we will deal with it. I promise you that. He then walked over to Sarah Jenkins. Ma'am, he said respectfully, I'm Sergeant Riley. I would be very grateful if you would be willing to provide a copy of that video to the department. It will be entered as official evidence in an internal affairs investigation. Starting immediately. I'll send it to every news station in the state, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly with adrenaline. But I'll send it to you, too. That's your right, Riley acknowledged with a nod. Thank you. He finished by addressing the crowd. All right. Folks, the show's over. Thank you for your concern. We'll handle it from here. He then helped Samuel close the door of his truck and made sure he was okay to drive. As Samuel got into his F-150, he paused and looked at Riley. He's just a boy, Marcus, he said quietly. A proud, foolish boy who made a terrible mistake. Don't let this ruin him. Let it teach him. Riley was taken aback. After everything Dean had put him through, Samuel Abernathy was advocating for mercy. Sir, with all due respect, what he did was— I know what he did, Samuel interrupted. I also know what it looks like when a man realizes he's crossed a line he can never uncross. He's facing a battle of his own now. The question is whether your department will teach him the right lesson from it. With that, Samuel started the old truck's engine. It turned over with a familiar rumbling cough. He gave Riley one last nod, put the truck in gear, and drove away, leaving Sergeant Riley standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by the pieces of a shattered afternoon and the profound, unexpected wisdom of a true American hero. In the days that followed, the story exploded. Just as she had promised, Sarah Jenkins sent her video to a local news affiliate in Phoenix. From there, it went viral. The footage was stark and damning. It showed Officer Dean's cold dismissal, his aggressive escalation, the illegal order to place hands on the car, the fabricated pretext for the search, and the dramatic, silent collapse of his authority. The glint of the Medal of Honor wasn't visible, but Dean's reaction to whatever he saw inside the truck was. His sudden, panicked unraveling told the whole story. The narrative was irresistible. Young cop bully's war hero has humiliating meltdown. For the Prescott Police Department, the fallout was swift and brutal. The phones rang off the hook. The chief held a press conference, issuing a public apology to Samuel Abernathy and the community. Officer Kevin Dean was immediately suspended without pay. Pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation, his badge and firearm were confiscated. He became a pariah overnight, a poster child for police misconduct, the blue wall of silence, which might have protected him in a more ambiguous situation, crumbled completely. You do not, under any circumstances, illegally harass an 84-year-old Medal of Honor recipient in broad daylight while being filmed. The investigation was a formality. Dean, on the advice of his police union representative, gave a full confession. He admitted he had no probable cause for a search. He admitted he had lied about smelling marijuana. He admitted his actions were driven by ego and frustration. There was nothing else he could do. The evidence was absolute. 3 weeks later, a review board recommended his termination, and the city council unanimously approved it. At 26 years old, Kevin Dean's law enforcement career was over. He had become a liability, a name that would be attached to a multi-million-dollar civil rights lawsuit that the city would inevitably settle. Samuel Abernathy, for his part, wanted none of it. He declined all interview requests, politely turning away the news vans that showed up at the gate of his ranch. When the city's lawyers contacted him about a settlement, he sent them a simple, handwritten letter. He asked that instead of paying him, they use the money to establish a more robust and continuous training program for their officers, a program focused not on tactics and statutes, but on de-escalation, constitutional rights, and community history. He wanted the Kevin Dean incident to become a lesson, not a payday. One evening, about a month after the incident, Samuel sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The air was cool and smelled of dust and creosote. He thought about the young man who had turned his life upside down. He didn't feel anger, nor did he feel any sense of victory. He mostly felt a deep, lingering sorrow. He thought about his conversation with Sergeant Riley, about his own words, "Let it teach him." He wondered what lesson Kevin Dean was actually learning. Was he learning about the Constitution and the limits of his authority? Or was he just learning that he had picked the wrong person to bully? Samuel had spent his life in service to an ideal. He had fought under one flag, believing it stood for liberty and justice. But he knew the reality was always more complex. The nation he fought for was also a nation where a young man in a uniform could feel entitled to humiliate an old man over a trivial matter. The battlefield had been simple, in its own brutal way. The enemy wore a different uniform. The objectives were clear. Here, at home. The lines were blurry. The conflicts were not about territory, but about pride, fear, and the quiet, insidious corrosion of trust between the people and those sworn to protect them. He hadn't won a victory that day downtown. He had merely survived a skirmish in a much longer, much more important war, the war for the soul of the country. His duty, he realized, had not ended when he took off his uniform 60 years ago. It had just changed form. His service now was to bear witness, to stand his ground quietly, and to advocate for mercy and wisdom in a world that often had too little of both. He was a soldier still, fighting for the America he believed in, one quiet act of dignity at a time. This story, which began with a simple parking ticket, serves as a powerful parable about the nature of authority, respect, and the hidden dangers of a fragile ego armed with a badge. To understand why Officer Dean acted the way he did, we have to look past the uniform and see the young man inside. He was driven by a desperate need for a black and white world, a world where rules are absolute and his role as an enforcer is clear and unquestioned. Samuel Abernathy and his old truck represented a gray area, a disruption to that fragile order. When Samuel met Dean's rigid authority not with fear, but with calm, unshakable dignity, Dean perceived it as a personal attack. His actions ceased to be about upholding the law and became entirely about defending his own ego. The lie about smelling marijuana wasn't a tactical decision. It was a desperate, unethical gambit to prove he was right and that the old man who refused to be intimidated was wrong. What if Samuel Abernathy hadn't been a war hero? What if the sun hadn't glinted off that Medal of Honor? The story would have ended very differently. An ordinary senior citizen would have been illegally searched, perhaps arrested on fabricated charges of resisting, and his life turned into a nightmare of legal fees and public records. Justice should never depend on the victim being a national hero. The rights that Officer Dean violated are granted to every single citizen, regardless of their background, their age, or the condition of their vehicle. True respect is not something that is earned by a medal. It is something that is owed by virtue of our shared humanity. Samuel protected himself with a lifetime of discipline and an unyielding sense of self. But the ultimate lesson is that our rights are our shield, and knowing them is our best defense. The moral of this encounter is not simply that police shouldn't bully war heroes. It's a deeper message for all of us. The uniform grants authority, but it does not grant supremacy. True strength is not demonstrated by how loudly you can give an order, but by the restraint and wisdom you show when you have the power to do otherwise. Samuel Abernathy's greatest act of service that day wasn't on a battlefield decades ago. It was on a quiet street corner, where he taught a young officer, and all of us who witnessed it. That dignity is a weapon that no amount of misguided authority can defeat. This story leaves us with heavy questions to consider. Do you believe the consequences for Officer Dean were appropriate, or should he have faced criminal charges for his actions? What do you think is the single most important lesson a new police recruit should learn before they are given a badge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it and subscribing for more stories that explore the moments that test our character and define our values.